everyone hear me okay?
We can hear you, we can see you.
Okay, well, you can see there's two Natalies. I don't know where that's come from, but the joy of technical issues. So sorry about that, everybody. I don't know what happened. Literally, just as I went to put my video on, it just decided not to work anymore. But I'm calm, I'm collected, you know, hey, take it all in my stride. And you guys have kept with us, that's great. There's 167 of you, so really, really appreciate that. Hopefully it all just sort of kicked in and restarted for you. So yeah, good, welcome to the last webinar of 2020. Can we believe it? I certainly can't. I can't believe we've been doing webinars nearly 2 years. It's just crazy. So yeah, today we're talking about flies around food. Now, some of you might be thinking, you know, December, is that really the time for flies? Not sure what happened there. However, they're going to be coming up. You know, our weather can get a bit crazy, certainly as 2021 comes in, and, you know, January, February, March can usually be quite cold, but you never know, you could get a bit of an increase in certain flies if that weather fluctuates a bit. So, hey, that's some good CPD points. Today, 1 point. So as always, 1 point for 1 hour of any training that you do. And certainly for these webinars, you may just go over the 1:30 line there, just because with a few technical issues, I may go over time a little bit. So hopefully that's okay for everybody coming along today. And yeah, in terms of, I think most of you have joined today are probably really used to these webinars. You know how they work, but just for those who are new, I can't see you, I can't hear you. I can obviously see a chat section where you guys are putting any technical issues, which I think possibly there's some sound issues there. I haven't had any messages from my colleague Kat, but some of you are saying maybe there's sound issues. So I'll carry on talking.
It looks like a couple of sound issues for some people, but I can hear you fine.
Okay.
So I think it might just be individuals.
Okay, great. Well, hopefully for those that are struggling to hear me a little bit, we will improve. Maybe I'll talk a bit louder. I've got my microphone here, so I'll pull it a bit closer to me. So yeah, sorry, back to the question. So the chat section there, Kat, who you just heard come on there and helped me out kindly a moment ago, will be keeping an eye on the chat section. So I won't be looking at that. So anything you want me to see, you need to put in the Q&A section. And that's for, obviously, questions that you want me to answer. I'm going to do this at the end of the webinar, the end of the presentation, just because sometimes you might have questions early on that actually later on in the webinar I will answer. So just through the general course of the presentation. But, you know, still state your questions on there. And obviously, if it is something I feel that I've answered, I'll state that. Just as so flies around food, it's a really big subject. And by no means, I want to manage your expectations here. I can't talk about the biology and life cycle of all of the different flies that we might talk about here. I will touch on it because it's important. However, the individual species, it won't be a detailed look at their biology and their behaviour and the exact kind of detail into whys and hows and what times of year and breeding cycles. I just haven't got time for that today. But at the end of the webinar, I've got some good links that you can go on to and, you know, other training modules that you can do that are a bit longer that can actually incorporate that more detailed information. So, but today, you know, anybody that's new to pest control, this will be great for you and you'll probably learn a fair bit, a lot of new information for you. For those that are a bit more experienced, been doing pest control maybe for a while, you'll probably, a lot of this stuff I'm going to talk about, you'll be familiar with. And hopefully, at least, it will be a reminder to you. And oh, yes, I forgot that information. Or, yes, good point, Natalie. I'll think about that next time we get an issue with these flies. You know, that's really, you know, I'm not aiming massively high here. You know, I just want you to enjoy it. I want you to get something from it. So hopefully we'll do that. And anything I don't cover that you want to ask a question about, as I said, put it in the Q&A section. I'll do my best to get to it. And as always, any questions I don't get to, I will endeavour to get a spreadsheet of Q&As together and send it out to everybody. Now, I'm going to start my presentation. So earlier when there was a screen sharing and I stopped sharing it, that's when it went a bit wrong. So Kat is there in the background. In case anything happens, she will pop in. So let's get on with the screen sharing. Okay. Now, which one do I share? Let's share this one. Let's go with that screen. Okay. So I'm relying on you guys to let me know if there's any problems. And obviously my colleague Kat, I can see some messages and you'll pop on if there's any issues. But I believe everything is fine. So this is the page that, messed everything up for me. So let's get off of that and go on to the agenda. So as I mentioned before, this session is going to uncover the importance of control. Because, of course, for you and your customer, the reasons why you're controlling any pest, especially flies, is really important. And then the species that we may find. So there's a few, and it's certainly not a fully comprehensive list because I couldn't possibly name all the flies you might come across, but certainly the more common ones. Bit of legislation, because you might say, oh God, here comes the legislation, but you know how that's really important for you, because that's how you communicate with your customer the importance. So you've got all the, the diseases and things like that, but you've also got the legislation, which is a really big part of why we control any pests, and certainly flies around food. So you knowing a bit about that legislation can help you educate your customer and get them to do what you need them to do. And then a bit about options for control and monitoring. Now, like I said, we've got a fair few species we're going to be covering, so it's not going to be a comprehensive study and look at all the treatment methods there are. I couldn't possibly cover that in an hour, but like I said, there are other options for training that you can do with us and some of your suppliers as well to get that real in-depth knowledge that you might want. But this can create a bit of enthusiasm hopefully for that. Okay, and then we'll do some questions. So yeah, let's carry on. I assume the technology is holding up. It hasn't disappeared from me, and no one has popped up saying there's an issue. So yeah, the importance then, of course, the first one there on the list is going to be disease and bacteria. So, due to the size and mobility of flies, they can move pretty far and pretty freely, as we know. Of course, they fly. That's certainly what I would do if I could fly. And they do bypass our exclusion measures sometimes that we put in. And because of the hairs on their bodies and the feet that they have and the areas that they land, that will pick up different bacteria, different diseases, can pick anything they land on, they can pick up on their body, on the hairs within their body, on their feet, and spread it around. Salmonella, E. coli, all the sort of food issues, food poisoning that can be picked up or, and transported through that physical means and then dropped off on the food surface that we're working on, or the food that's possibly being delivered to the customers. And things like gastroenteritis as well. It can certainly, cause all sorts of things. And that is not a comprehensive list. There's a lot of diseases and bacteria that flies can cause. And strangely enough, in terms of disease transmission, we assume that the studies on disease transmission for flies is absolutely foolproof. And of course, it's a lot of common sense and a lot of studies as well, but it's still not actually fully understood in terms of, how they do it exactly, what diseases they can pass. It is a lot of the time due to, common sense as well as the studies of the flies individually and what they can carry. But of course, with the numbers that we get and the way that they move, it makes sense, doesn't it, that they're going to be able to transmit these diseases and bacterias. Contamination of products as well from the flying insect itself. If they die, certainly EFKs, we get that if we have an electrical grid at the back rather than a glue board where they can kind of, explode into many pieces. So we can get contamination. And just through, people swatting them or them dying from, obviously natural causes, they can end up in places we don't want them. And, the image behind this slide there, imagine a fly turning out in one of those tins of bread and getting put on a shelf and bought by a customer. That's a lot of legal action there, and possible reputation issues. If you were to open a bag of anything and you would find a fly within it, your first thought is going to be kind of disgust, and kind of your feeling towards that organisation is going to maybe drop quite quickly. They're going to lose your business, possibly financial loss, as well as you're going to tell everybody about it, which affects their reputation and financial loss. You might put it on social media. That's going to go even further. These are the differences in from now to 20 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, that that reputation loss was still there, but now it's so much greater. And then the legal obligation, I will go into the more specifics on that, but there is a legal obligation that these food premises do not have issues or infestations of flies that can contaminate their food. Things can happen, of course, but that's why proactive pest control is always best, to cover that legal obligation. And I mean, with any pest control, the moral obligation, you think about it, if you're a worker in a factory or a recycling centre or a butcher's, and there's a fly issue, that's not particularly pleasant for you as an employee, and then also your customers, of course. It's a moral obligation. You don't want them to feel uncomfortable or feel like they're at risk from problems with flies. So yeah, there's many different things. It says there, they feed from, a lot of the time, very unsanitary materials, and of course they need to land on that material to feed from it, and they're going to be picking up all sorts of horrible things. But yeah, there's a long list of diseases and bacteria that could possibly cause, but most common ones, food poisoning, gastroenteritis, E. coli, things like that, real issue. Okay, so I think these are things we generally talk about every day, all day, about most pests. It kind of it goes without saying, doesn't it? But that's the importance of why we deal with flies. So I mentioned at the beginning, biology of all the different species individually, which I'm going to show to you in a moment, I can't possibly go into, but all fly species have a complete metamorphosis. Now, this may be a new concept to anybody that is brand new to the industry and maybe hasn't, carried out in-depth training, or they're level 2 at the moment. But for those of you that are more experienced in pest control, it's certainly a very familiar statement that there's a complete metamorphosis. Compared to cockroach presentation that I'd done a month ago, they're an incomplete metamorphosis. And the difference is that with a complete metamorphosis, it's a lot more complex. It's actually, really a really good process to be able to give that insect time to grow into a very effective body, very effective insect and exoskeleton. So from the egg, when they hatch out, they will all go into a larvae stage. And that larvae is the real important bit. So when I start talking about control options, that larvae is really the really important bit. I'll get to that a bit later on. But the things that larvae feed from, a lot of times the source of the infestation. So we'll talk about that. So once they have finished with their larvae, part of the metamorphosis, which varies. It varies on temperature, it varies on food source and how available that is. But it's usually sometimes days, but generally weeks. It'll take to go through that metamorphosis into a pupae. So they'll go into a hard shell. There's a few little tiny differences with some species of flying insects, which again I'll mention in a moment on the next slide. But generally, it's all a hard structure, very immobile, in a crack or crevice somewhere, and it's ready to pupate into the adult. Of course, when it hatches out into that adult. Compared to the incomplete metamorphosis, which is nymphal stages, so they don't have the larvae and pupae stage, they just have the egg and then a nymph, which is a resemblance of the actual adult itself. But I'll leave it at that. I'm not going to go into that because we're talking about complete metamorphosis here. So egg, larvae, pupae, and then adult. So really important to remember that. And I've just got a few examples here with the egg laid on and around the preferred food sources. You've got meat, rotting vegetation matter, which some flies, I'll go in again into the detail of which flies may lay these eggs in certain areas. Drain sludge, liquids like beers and vinegar can cause certain fly species issues, stagnant water as well. So, where the eggs are actually laid, they're laying those eggs in that area so that the larvae can hatch out and feed on that food source. So that's the important thing about the eggs and the larvae, is that the adult is laying those eggs in the area where the larvae is going to feed, because without that, they're not going to get too far, are they? So really important in terms of that. So let's go on to some of the species themselves. Now, correct identification, it helps you and your customer, and it's so important. Just dealing with a fly, I've got a problem with flies, it's not really going to help anybody, because you need to know what that species is so that you can track down that source of that infestation. As I said, we can't possibly cover the biology of all of the fly species you may encounter, but as you see, this list here, it shows a wide diversity of flies that you may find in, say, for example, an electrical fly killer, an EFK, or possibly your customer reports seeing them around as well. And it is fundamental that the first thing we do with any fly issue is go back to the basics and understand the biology of the flying insect that we're dealing with. So again, identification is really important, because how can you consider where the infestation is coming from or why those flies are there if you don't know what species it is? We can't possibly. With the common housefly, for example, their preferred food source to lay their eggs within is going to be completely different to, say, for example, the drain fly or the sewage fly. I've got both of them in the same line there. They are quite different. We'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. But their food source, where they need to lay their eggs, is pretty different. And that's really important when it comes to, tackling an issue that might have occurred. So in terms of identification, it's always really handy to have a handheld magnifying glass with you. You don't expect you to carry around a microscope in your van like the ones you can see on the image here, but certainly those handheld, not microscopes, magnifying glasses, so that when you come across a fly, you can look at it a bit closer. Because if you think about it, when you've got an EFK machine and you've got maybe 200 flies in it, in the midst of summer, and you've got a lot of flies in there, you can generally pick out the ones that look slightly different. But could you just sort of look at it quite easily and identify them without looking at them a bit closer? Some of them maybe, some of them maybe not. Whereas if you have that handheld magnifying glass, it makes it a lot easier to be able to look at the different aspects of that fly, the different colours that might be there, different variations that get you that identification. And one thing that I think we all need to manage ourselves in terms of what we can do and what we're capable of, you've got to ask yourself, is it really an expectation that you can remember every single fly species that there is and remember the identification, so that you can just come out with it any time of the day, any time of the year, and not have to, re-educate yourself on them or have an identification book? I don't think so, because, there's so many species out there, and you may not come across them from, 1 month to the other, or even 1 year to the other. So when you do get a fly species, you'll absolutely recognise it. But do you really know which species it is? So get that magnifying glass carried around with you, maybe an identification book as well. We don't have one of those thus, but again, speak to your suppliers. I'm sure you better find some good fly ID catalogues that you can carry around with you. Really useful. I had that back in the day when I was doing pest control, and it was really, really helpful. If I just go on to this next slide here, it shows a bit more about the different species. So I'll talk a little bit more about them individually, because it is important we understand where these flies are going to be breeding, because we need to be able to address it. Now, a common scenario: you go on a routine visit, you check an EFK unit, and you find that there's a strange number of flies in that unit that aren't necessarily normally there. So you've got to then identify that fly. So if we just go through a few of these species here, so clusterflies. Now, the question we might ask ourselves is that for each of these, you would say to yourself, right, where do I start my investigation? I've got an electrical fly killer here, or a report from the customer that there's a lot of flies, and I've identified them as clusterflies. So what could you possibly do with those in terms of finding the source of the infestation? Well, as we know, some of us may know, is that clusterflies actually lay their eggs within soil and decaying leaves on the floor, and in sort of grassy banks and areas such as that. And the larvae the eggs will hatch out into a larvae. They'll dig down into the soil and find an earthworm, and that's where they then parasite, or they're parasitic to the earthworm. They'll delve in and feed from that earthworm. So it's pretty nasty stuff. You could make probably quite a nice horror film out of it. But that's how the clusterflies life cycle, if you like, goes through. And so how would you address that? You can't. You can't spray a whole acreage of a field just to try and deal with a problem. And even if you did, even if that was legally allowed, or there was a product you could have for that, how do you know where they are? They burrow into the ground. There's no possible way we can do that. So the only way we can deal with cluster flies is that identifying those properties that you've got that may have a clusterfly issue regularly each year, autumn and spring. So autumn, they'll be coming into the property to get a warm area for them to be able to hibernate. And in the spring, they'll be coming back out to then enjoy the spring and the summer, like all of us, and carry on with their egg laying and their production. So, it's only really during possibly about now, I think we're possibly coming to the end of clusterfly season. But certainly over the last month or two, a lot of you have probably had clusterfly call outs where they're either in attic spaces in thousands, it can be in thousands, sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands. Other times you can have a south-facing building that when you open a window, they kind of fall out of the cracks and they're kind of all clustered around there, and that's them trying to get in, trying to get themselves all warm, ready for the winter and hibernate. So usually clusterflies you can't. Whereas if we look at, let's take common house fly. So for them, they usually lay their eggs on rotting vegetable materials, animal feces sometimes as well. So you might, if you've suddenly got a big increase in common house flies in your EFKs or a report from your customer, and the first thing you think is, right, okay, they feed from rotting vegetable matter and possibly animal feces. So let's look close to home. Is there an issue with the bin storage? Is there an issue with their disposal? Is there anything that they're doing with the food that they're not using that could possibly be causing this? We're not going to be looking at drains or anything like that. Common housefly are not going to, lay their eggs around drains or anything there. I mean, possibly if there's a lot of food waste that's been mulched up and brushed down a drain, which you'd hope you wouldn't see. I don't think an EHO would be too happy with that. There's a possibility, but generally it's bin areas and areas where they're disposing of, food waste, predominantly vegetable matter. And also with animal feces. So if you've got, this is a similar thing of lesser housefly as well, is that if you have a poultry farm nearby or a pig farm nearby, there's a good possibility that actually this issue that you're getting with an increase of flies is not close to home. It's actually from a neighbouring property. That can happen. I've experienced that myself. I was working at it's good for scenarios. It gives you a bit of visual play, if you like. I was working at a secondary school and I noticed a large amount of flies in the electrical fly killer in the kitchen. Now, lesser house flies are actually, there was a lot of them in there. Now, just as a side note with the lesser house flies, they're not as particularly fond of UV lights. They will still be attracted to EFK units, and UV light will still attract them to a degree, but they're not as bothered as, say, common housefly, blue bottles. They love, they're pretty interested. They'll get attracted over a period of time. It's not instantaneous. They don't fly in somewhere, see that EFK and go, oh, I'm going to go over there. It can take them some time to find it, even up to 24, 30 hours to actually want to go to that EFK. So it's not instantaneous. Some species are pretty fond of it. Fruit fly are not that fond of it. Similar to house flies, again, you still may find fruit fly in your EFK catch tray, but they're not as fond. They're not as impressed by UV light as some other flies. So you find sometimes numbers will fluctuate, not just because they're not in the environment, but because they're not as attracted to it. You can get different things like black lights as well. Again, I'm not going to go into the details of that because I just haven't got time, but speak to your suppliers and they can probably suggest to you the best EFK for you. But going back to that secondary school I had, I noticed lesser housefly and I had to go out, get my insect ID book out and have a look through and looking at, I know it's a fly species, of course, it's got wings and, pretty obvious it's a fly. So I looked in that section of my identification manual, and from there, I identified it from the size of the body, the size of the compound eye. Obviously, they're quite big and quite red, and also the numbers that they were in. And I sort of looked at it and realised, okay, well, they're pretty fond of animal feces. And actually, it was a time of year where the local farm was spreading muck on the field. They were doing muck spreading, of course. The associated work that goes with that was an assumption. And, to this day, it's still something that they have to deal with. was that this muck spreading was causing a lesser housefly issue due to the storage of it and how they were handling it. So, it was thinking outside the box, and it's not just always about what's on the site. It could be what's in the wider environment. And actually with lesser houseflies, they do prefer things like poultry units. So if you've got a problem with lesser housefly, you might think to yourself, well, actually, I know that there's a farm over the road, or not too far down the road, and it's a poultry farm, and there's a good chance it could be coming from there. Now, you haven't got a magic wand; you can't go and sort their problem out for everybody's benefit, but something to think about and try and get a plan together on how you're going to address that. And interestingly, with lesser housefly, is that males actually migrate a considerable longer distance away from the food source than what the female does. The female stays close to the food source generally so that she can lay her eggs and be productive, whereas the male will move, some considerable distance. So even if this poultry farm is, half a mile down the road, it could, maybe not half a mile. I haven't really got the distances down or in this presentation, but if it's a fair way down the road, you could still be getting those males that are flying that considerable distance and catching them in your EFKs, or even seeing them in the environment that's causing you a problem. And with blue bottles, we all blow flies, blue bottles, it's carcasses. It doesn't need to be rotting meat either. We all assume that it's rotting meat that will just attract these flies, but it's not actually. It's fresh meat a lot of the time. And then obviously as it starts to decompose, of course, it will still attract flies that way. But as soon as that meat is available and on an open surface or in a bin uncovered, or even a rotting carcass and on a farmyard, or under floorboards, if you've been dealing with rodents or anything like that, the flies will detect it very quickly. They've got a real keen sense of smell and can detect that fresh meat and carcass from a long distance. These are all things that you're thinking about. We've got a clusterfly that their preferred food source is way out there in the distance. You'll never know where it would be exactly. In the ground, some of those earthworms, they're everywhere, so you couldn't possibly address that. Whereas a common housefly, lesser housefly, you've got options. You can think, right, what's their waste like? Well, how are they dealing with things? Is it coming from on this site? And if you're pretty confident it's not, and you look further afield, it's discussions you need to have with your customer and maybe neighbouring sites if that's a possibility. Each site will vary. It's not always possible, but certainly something to address. And so with the blue bottles, the carcasses. Now, fruit flies, they very much, rotting vegetable matter also. Certainly, fruit and sour milk and beer, things like that was quite common in we call it a bar fly sometimes, don't we? Because we see them in bars a lot where, alcohol, especially beer, being tipped down a drain that hasn't been used, or those drip trays that you get from the pumps, they're tipping them down the sink they've got in the corner and kind of not really thinking any more of it. Whereas because of that U-bend that's in that sink there, you can actually get a build-up of that liquid. If they're not washing that U-bend through regularly, they can get a build-up of this liquid that they like, and they can start then laying their eggs and causing an issue. You might sometimes see a fly or two coming from that area. And certainly under bars as well, you can get the residue that drips down underneath the bar lips there. It's quite fruit flies are actually quite common in distilling sort of vinegar, because they do like vinegar quite a lot. So again, it's sometimes on a bigger scale it can be a real management issue, but certainly for food premises, it's usually quite easy to target down what's causing the fruit fly issue. And sewerage flies, as the name suggests, with sewerage flies, they certainly will breed on fungi, algae, bacteria in the sludge that kind of makes up the biological layer present on the surface of sewerage. So this is where they like to lay their eggs. And talking in a practical sense of the subject we're on here is if you've got a kitchen that's maybe even got a drain hatch or a sewer hatch, close to the kitchen, or sometimes even within the kitchen, you lift that up and you can see a lot of flies around it. I had an issue in a nursing home once where sewerage flies were a real problem. Now, I mentioned about the importance and in terms of disease and bacteria. Now, sewerage flies in a nursing home is not a good thing. No fly is a good thing, but you imagine what's on their body, what they're carrying on their body, and you've got those really, really vulnerable people within a nursing home. it's a real public health concern. There was lots of parties involved, and environmental health officers, and we've got some builders in. So we're just trying to figure out where this, sewage fly. I mean, there was a lot of them in most places of this nursing home. We're lifting up drain lids. We're, kind of trying to problem solve. But actually, it come down to when we were talking to the builders, they'd recently disconnected a drain, and after having a look, they realised that it hadn't been bunged up properly. There was actually a crack in an old pipe, and some sewage had leaked out into a cavity and was just kind of sitting there nicely, really. And the sewage flies were having a whale of a time. So we found it, problem solved, and that's all it was. We just had to find that problem. Now, if we'd gone in there, so it's okay, we'll just wipe the walls down with some insecticide, or put some of these, traps up or an EFK up, and we'll just deal with them as we go along. It never really would have dealt with the problem. It would have gone on for a very, very, very long time, and possibly, people got very ill, and the vulnerable situation that was in, certainly people could have died. Elderly people are certainly more vulnerable than younger people, because of obviously their immune system maybe wouldn't fight off things like E. coli, as well as or gastroenteritis. A real concern for environments as sensitive as a nursing home or care home. It was, it wasn't straightforward, but it was just trying to, nail it down and get to the areas where those flies seemed more concentrated. And then we started talking to the building operators and the contractors, saying, okay, well, what's happened recently? What work has been done recently? Has there been any, upgrades to anything? And as we started talking, we gradually got there and figured, right, yeah, there's a problem with this pipe, and they solved that issue. So some real investigation sometimes. It's not always easy, but investigation, that's the fun bit, really, isn't it? That's what we like. And just a bit about common house mosquitoes, or a gnat. Culex pippins is its scientific name, and they are biting, so they do bite you. Now, they're aquatic, as we know, with mosquitoes. The interesting thing I mentioned in the metamorphosis stage, or the pupae, most of them are pretty solid, pretty hard, tucked away in a crack and crevice, and don't really move from there until they're ready to hatch out into an adult. Now, with the mosquito larvae, they're aquatic. So when the mosquito lays their eggs, they lay it on a surface of usually stagnant water. Now, there's some, I think, midge and gnat species that can lay eggs in running water, but they still usually keep it to the edge, because obviously that mechanism of the water running is not going to be viable for a good egg production and survival. So they need that stagnant water. So hence things like of course, around, slow moving rivers and lakes, but in gardens, or at the back of possibly restaurants, if you've got a water butt, or, a bucket that's been put outside because, they were mopping the floor and it's been left there and no one's really bothered about it, and there's an accumulation of water in the bottom that's been sat there for a few months, and the weather's quite warm, you're going to get, mosquitoes are going to love that. They're going to get their eggs in there. They'll hatch out into a larvae. So again, it's an aquatic larvae. They will live on the surface of that water, and they have a breathing pipe that they use to breathe. But also they move very quickly away from danger. So if you've got some stagnant water in a bucket, it's always good to just sort of tap the top of the water with your finger, and you'll see them swim to the bottom. That's what they'll do, the larvae. It's quite fun, really. Sad, but hey, we all have our vices. And what they do is when they pupate. So they will come to the surface and they pupate in a similar fashion. We should have some pictures of it, actually. They're quite a fascinating pupae. But they will sit on that surface, but they have a breathing pipe. Now, and again, if there's any disturbance or any danger to them, they can still swim away, even in that pupal stage. They're pretty fascinating. But again, if you notice that you're catching mosquitoes or midges or anything like that in your EFK, then you've got to think about the breeding areas, such as standing water, and with the biting midge, they don't need, they're not aquatic. The larvae need moisture to develop, certainly, but also air and food, and they're not strictly aquatic or terrestrial. They're kind of a bit in between. They're they like to be difficult. So yeah, just looking at, just be familiar. Carry that identification book around with you. Carry, when you get a fly issue, just read up on it. It gives you an opportunity to remind yourself of these species. We're not entomologists, and entomologists have their job to do and they're great at identifying, and they know the real detail. Whereas, when we're out there on the front line dealing with it, we need to know the species we're dealing with, and sometimes we need to carry around resources with us that allow us to identify it. And I please ask you to do that. It will benefit you so much. And if you're a manager of any technicians, or you've got a company of technicians, get them some identification books. I know you could maybe list a whole load, but certainly flies. There's a lot of fly species out there, and a lot of different scenarios that different species can cause problems in. So, I really do recommend that, if at all possible. So I don't think I've missed too much out on these species. Again, difficult to cover everything. I can't believe it's 10 past 1 already. So I'm just going to move on to the next slide. I mentioned about legislation. Just going to check there's no issues. No one's messaged me yet. That's good. So of course, food, flies around food. Of course, it's going to be food legislation. It's the issue. It's about how you use this in a practical situation to benefit you, to assist with getting the problem sorted. Now, the Food Safety Act 1990 is not specifically for pest management. It doesn't specifically mention pest management, the Act itself. That notices will usually be served under this legislation. So let's say someone breaks a condition of the hygiene regulation, usually an enforcement officer will issue a notice under the Act. That's just generally how legislation works. It's like with health and safety. Usually there's breaches of legislation under regulations, whereas when an officer, tells someone off about it and serves notice on them, they'll actually quote the Act legislation, because that's the big bit. That's the, king and queen of the legislation that they, need to use to actually enforce things. Whereas the regulations give them more detail on what's expected. So of course, Food Safety Act is important with that, with prohibition notices and improvement notices. But it's the Food Hygiene Regulations 2006 that do have particular reference to pests and flies and how you should go about designing your property to prevent. Because of course, if you were to purchase a restaurant and you purchased it and set it up in a way that was really open to the elements, pests can get in easily, you haven't got great waste storage, all these things that will almost definitely cause pest issues, need to be considered and need to be prevented and addressed and made sure that doesn't occur. So, this is a few out here. This is what it says in the legislation. This isn't just me, paraphrasing. This is how it says: the layout, design, construction will be in such a way to help prevent pests. So, that's where proofing comes in. So when you're talking to customers about, putting that fly screen up, about installing an EFK machine, about hygiene processes that they need to be following, it's in the food hygiene regulations. They have to do that. It's not just if you fancy it. They have to do it. Another example is windows. So if you have, I've got a window here, it opens to the outside. Now, if I had a kitchen in this room and I was cooking food, the law would say that either that window has to be, permanently closed, i.e. normally drilled shut so that no one can open it, or if it has got a window that opens to the elements, then you need to have a fly screen on that. If you need to sort of get air circulation through the kitchen, and by way of that it's a door or a window that's open, you have to have a fly screen on it. Can't just, on your merry way, open it up and hope for the best. Have to have, it's in the regulations. So again, when you're out there, you're not just trying to sell your customer a fly screen. Not, they're kind, you're just trying to sell me a, proofing methods, or, do I really need it? Yes, they do. If their window opens to the elements, they need a fly screen on it. If their premises is designed in such a way where a mouse could get under the door, or flies can get through the window, or the hygiene measures are not great and it's causing possibly drain fly issues or fruit fly issues, then they need to deal with it. It's not just if you fancy it or can be bothered. An EHO will certainly pick up on it. So, again, proofing, insect screens, EFK, regular inspections. Now, in terms of the regular inspections, there's usually that common question around, do they have to have a professional doing the inspections? And as with everything, they don't legally have to have an external pest control contractor to come and do those checks. However, if those because the pest control checks need to happen, there needs to be someone on that site. If they're not employing an external company, there needs to be somebody on that site that has got the competence to inspect and identify issues that might occur. So that would be, in most situations, unless you're talking about real large scale factories, large organizations where they've got a lot of employees and a lot of structure to it, generally, they won't have that person that's got the competence to be able to inspect and identify pest problems. So again, it's important for you to know about legislation because it helps you. It helps you, keep your work with your customer, and it helps you to make your customer understand why they need to do it. It's not just because, you fancy telling them to do it or you want to, make some money off of fly screens. They have to do it. They have to do it. If they can't keep that window closed, they need to do it. I haven't put it on here, but in terms of flies more specifically, so there's something called the Cleaner Neighbourhoods Regulations. It's a bit of legislation that all local authorities work under, and as the title suggests, it's about cleaner neighbourhoods. And for example, let's say I have got my butcher's shop and I'm quite happy there, and I've got a recycling centre that's a few blocks down, and suddenly I start getting a real problem with house flies. I'm going to think, what is going on? I like a lot of house flies, and of course for me as a food business, that's a real issue. So looking around, I can see it's nothing that I'm causing. It could be a recycling centre. It could be a waste tip. It could be another. I mentioned it earlier, didn't I, with that scenario of a separate site causing you a fly problem or your customer a fly problem. Now, the cleaner neighbourhoods is what would normally address that because it's not actually, the site, the food premises itself that's causing the problem. It's a different site. Now, that's when local authorities usually get involved, and notices can be served for improvement and investigations can be done on the site that's causing the issue. And there is there's landfill legislation as well that's specific about flies and keeping them down because it's environmentally unfriendly and antisocial, and again the cleaner neighbourhoods legislation certainly addresses that. So if you do have neighbouring properties that are causing any of your customers great concern or great issue, then there is legislation there to support you. So keep yourself up with that, up to date with that. Okay, blimey, time flies, isn't it? We're having fun. Identifying those problems. It's just as I mentioned it earlier, often, fly management is proactive. You go in there, you want to help and prevent, you get the screens on, you make sure the gaps and crevices and things are sealed up and their hygiene is good. Great. And also, checking EFKs. That's something that usually we do on, some routine inspections, if it's so desirable. Certainly food premises, it's quite common for, EFK inspection to occur. And also, we might see them flying on the visits. A customer may call you because there's a surge in flies all of a sudden. And sometimes, an EHO might have clocked them as well on an inspection. They might be looking in the electrical fly killer and you may not have been there for a few weeks, so they've just picked up on it quicker, or they go out into the bin area and notice an accumulation of flies that they're not happy about. So it's a few different ways that the problem might become to the forefront of your mind, or you've been made aware of it. It might be your own inspection, it might be your customers calling it through. I've referred to it a bit here, identifying your fly, of course, I've gone on about that a bit. I think we've all got it. Again, EFKs are handy for it. And some of you may have heard of fly catch analysis and the interpretation of that data. Now, this fly catch analysis doesn't always need to be fancy and complicated. You may not always write it down even. It may be a mental thing that you do and you kind of clock the flies if A, there's not a huge amount of them, and B, you might have a site that it doesn't have an accreditation like the British Retail Consortium or anybody telling them they have to do these trend analysis. It might just make me clock, mentally, but in some situations a recorded fly catch analysis is best and may be required for your customer. There's, again, there's consultants out there that can provide this for you, or you can learn to do it yourself and have a in-house, template and guide on how to do that. It's pretty simple. You have a EFK number, you count the flies in there and the species. This is why identification is important, because you'll identify those species, you'll count those numbers and put them in a nice chart, and it'll show you any trends throughout that year, possibly even a 5-year cycle sometimes. So interpreting, that's good. I've just actually, let me click here. I did put up just playing around to give you some kind of idea of what I'm talking about. Nat's Butchers. It's a business plan I'm thinking of. Fly catch trend for 2020. And this is a common view. I mean, this is taken from nothing other than me just typing in some numbers, but with in mind that, of course, July to September, or March to July, we're going to start seeing an increase in fly numbers. Certainly July to September, because of the weather. The environmental conditions is perfect for flies. So we're going to see an increase. You're going to have that increase, but what you've got to decide is whether or not that increase is acceptable. So, for example, here, you kind of got 5 or 10 flies in the EFK each time you go on a visit, and a quarterly, we've got quarterly visits here. It's acceptable, whereas, you get a sudden spike of common, this blue one here is common housefly. You get a sudden spike around there, and you kind of find 80 or 90, common houseflies in your EFKs. Maybe there's a problem. You've got to get that level. What's a problem? What number is a problem? And that's the other part of a fly catch trend. And, if you get a process, you decide what your baseline in terms of acceptable numbers is. You discuss it with your customer as well. In some situations, it might be just a few, it might be 10. In some situations, it is 0. If you work for a sensitive site, maybe a pharmaceutical manufacturer or something else that's particularly sensitive, where a manufacturing process is absolutely sterile, then of course not one single fly is acceptable. So, the chance would be very different. It really is site specific. But if I was in, the butchers, and in, July, this third quarter here, it was showing that there's a massive sudden spike in common house flies, and me as a pest controller, I'd go, right, Natalie, your butchers, big spike here. I'm thinking maybe, are you getting busy at that time of year? Do you think maybe waste management's, suffered a little bit? How do you store your waste? Let's go and have a look at your bin area. What's going on there? It might be, again, it could be something that's not on their site, but it's good to be able to see these things, and you can kind of, it's quite a good impact. Certainly auditors will like to see things like this. Those of you that deal with sites that require things like this, you'll certainly know about it. But just to go back to that, like I said, you and your customer should know what the acceptable level of flies is, or have an idea of that. So trend analysis can give you a real indication to, something's happening, something different's happened, something's changed, we need to investigate. And if you do need to investigate something, like I've said, find the source, you look for it, you ask, you talk about what's happened, what's different. Is a new building estate gone up nearby, and now, Nat's Butcher has got an extra 50 customers a day because there's a whole new load of people living in the village. So therefore my waste is exploding a bit more, and I haven't, managed it properly, and I've got these overflowing bins everywhere. Ask, talk to them, look for it, investigate, maybe even smell. Sometimes you can smell the issue. Certainly if you've got, sewerage fly problems or something like that. Not always, bottom of the list, but sometimes you can smell. Of course, hygiene and proofing we've mentioned. Now, in terms of insecticide, you may use things like wipe down surfaces where flies are alighting and sitting. And with lesser housefly in comparison to common housefly, lesser housefly do actually like to sit on the walls quite a lot, and they may sit on chains that are hanging down as well, and you notice they alight in these areas. So possibly as a knockdown you might use an insecticide preparation, but site specific. If you've got clusterflies, of course that's a common thing that you'll use, fogging or ultra low volume in attic spaces, or in a space where there's a lot of those flies. You've got to take the right precautions, of course, especially in attics. I mean, if you're getting clusterflies in in a roof space that's above a food production or food site of any kind, of course you've got that contamination issue you need to think about, because you're going to have hundreds, possibly thousands of flies dying en masse and depositing God knows where. But also, of course, the normal things like bats and other non-target animals when we're fogging. But certainly, you've got to think about, if you're using insecticides, obviously the environment you're in, the insecticide risk itself, but also, well, what's going to happen to them flies that contact it? Are they going to randomly fall and die in areas I don't want them to? It's a real, a lot of the time with fly problems, insecticide is not necessarily always needed. It's a hierarchy. Always go down that hierarchy, non-toxic first, and then all the way down through proofing and hygiene and so on. And then if you need to use insecticides, just consider it very carefully and make sure it's safe. Okay. Right, I'm going to go through quickly on to just a quick reminder. I said at the beginning there's some ideas here for extra reading. We've got PPC 91. It was a little while ago, but the article in there is still relevant on flies, and it's actually controlling flies around food. It's a bit more detailed in terms of some of the species. And then these are the courses that we do that are specifically, I feel, related to flies and flies around food. Obviously, identifying them, an identification course, and we do have an online specific course for flies and their control. And again, it's a larger course, goes into a lot more detail. You can possibly get a lot more out of it. But yeah, just a bit of a taster today to get you thinking about a few bits. Okay, so questions. All right, I'm going to stop sharing. Let's hope it doesn't go wrong. That's when it went wrong last time. Okay, we're good. Right, so blimey, we've got 11 questions. Let's see if we can, okay, so there's some questions about, can the links be accessed post-webinar? Yep, absolutely, we'll be uploading the webinar after today. And in terms of the links for the training, they're all on our website. Look under training, you'll see them all there. So that's no problem. Natalie, I will never forget as a child, I remember riding my bike, shouting at my friends alongside me, and suddenly I swallowed a large juicy fly. Do you think it could be harmful? So David, if that fly's landed on something pretty nasty and is now on its way down your gullet, if you like, possibly, but I'm not medical. I don't know all the science behind how we work, but certainly as the fly starts to move further down the gut, we've got a lot of acids and a lot of harmful things down there that will, quickly deal with that fly. But yes, on its way down, certainly could. It's always my first thought. I think every single one of us have got a fly in the mouth, and it's just the worst. But yeah, absolutely. There's no reason why not. However, I think because of the salivas that we have and the acids we have in our, in our mouth, we do have acids in our mouth as well. That can deal with it sometimes. But of course, bacteria and viruses and all sorts, they do have very strong things. So, Natalie, anonymous, is it true housefly lay their eggs in dry sand rather than moist area, i.e. wet soil? Well, no, sand certainly not. There's got to be a food source there. That is it. That is the only thing that matters, food source. So a fly will not lay its egg anywhere that's not specific to their species in terms of what food their larvae need. So therefore, no, they're not going to lay them in sand unless that happens. It might just be, so what normally happens if you've got, let's say you've got a nice little pile of vegetable matter and the houseflies are laying their eggs on there. Another contamination issue can happen when they actually pupate. So most fly species, if not all of them, when the larvae are done, they're kind of all full up and they're like, right, I'm ready to pupate now. They'll move away from that food source and then start pupating. Now that movement itself can actually contaminate, because I've had that where a bin outside has been particularly bad with flies, and I found loads of pupae just dotted around on the floor inside the sort of curtains where the butcher's was, and that's because they're moving away from that food source and pupating, but they need that food source. They're not just gonna sort of lay it somewhere where it's dry or wet. They need that food source. So yeah, hopefully that helped. I'm not sure who that was, it's anonymous, but hopefully it helped. What is the threat by mosquitoes in and around the food area? Body contamination mostly. Any insect of any description at any point that's in a food area, whether it be production or delivery or service, is a problem because, you know, if it gets swatted or, you know, dies or lands on a surface where it kind of gets a bit stuck to, that's contamination. That's the body of the insect is contaminating it. So, yeah, not good. And if you've got quite a large number of them, it's a real nuisance. And, you know, you've got a moral obligation to, you know, get those things out of there. And, of course, mosquitoes can bite. And, you know, there are a few diseases associated with mosquitoes. You know, varying. We've got different invasive species coming in, but with our, you know, Conix pippins, our native or common mosquito, there are a few issues there. And I know some of you might ask me what they are. Do you know what? My brain has just completely gone now. But you can have a look, can't you? You've got your ID books and your technical manuals. They can cause some problems. So I am never averse to saying, do you know what? I can't remember that. That's what you should be. Go and read about it. Find out about it. It really is a great thing to do. I dealt with that well, didn't I? So, Mark, we are dealing more and more frequently with forage flies recently. Yep, that can become an issue. Some comments here. They're good to know what you guys are dealing with. Is there any solution for house flies and blue bottle infestations in open dining restaurant? Problem is flies cross from the outside freely. Yeah, absolutely. As we said in the beginning, you know, flies, they fly. You know, they will freely move around, and some species will travel a long way from the food source, i.e., you know, the males normally. Now, the only way, like I mentioned at the beginning, it's creating an environment where those flies can't get in. If they can, if they're getting in big numbers, then there's a problem. That problem needs to be, you know, found. Now, whether it's that source of the infestation is locally, obviously it can be doubted. Whether if it's not locally, it's a longer issue to consider. You know, get in touch with local authorities, getting the help from environmental action officers and environmental health officers so they can address any site that might be causing the problem, the flies coming from, that's not your customers. But certainly things, you know, like fly screens and EFKs, you can get discrete EFKs now that, you know, kind of like nice little fancy lights on the wall, and customers in a restaurant wouldn't have a clue what they are. And even if they did, you know, they look pretty nice. And actually that restaurant is doing their thing to keep flies down. But there must, if you have, I'm guessing this question has come because you've got a restaurant or an open dining area. Now, actually looking at that question, I don't know whether you mean open dining area as in outside, because we don't get that in the UK very much. We're not very al fresco here. We get excited when we can, when the weather's good enough and we can sit outside and eat. Yeah, we get really excited. And you know what, a few flies I don't think we care about. But yeah, certainly if you're in a country or an area where you do eat outside a lot and there's a problem with flies, of course you're out in the environment. It's difficult. You know, a lot of the time you can, you know, if there's certain canopies and things like that, you can maybe get some solutions. But really site specific, it's really difficult to answer unless I know more about the site specific conditions, you know, non-targets or the environment, or whether the sun hits it south facing, north facing, is there a parapet? You know, there's all these things you need to consider on how you'd be able to address that if it's al fresco dining, is what you mean. But certainly inside, we should be able to stop them. Okay. Okay, so we're a couple of minutes over, but like I said in the beginning, anybody that needs to shoot off, I really appreciate you bearing with me, but I'm going to carry on just for a few more questions because, yeah, my technical problems at the beginning. Okay, is a lesser housefly that flies in a square pattern? Yes, so I forgot to mention that yeah, absolutely. So the good way to identify lesser housefly from common housefly is that the lesser housefly, usually between 20 and 30 centimetres, it'll fly and then just acutely turn. So it kind of like, you know, it won't be triangles or any particular pattern. It just kind of, you know, middle of your room like this. And it seems quite happy with itself, enjoying its acute turns. But yeah, absolutely, it has that flying pattern that's 20 to 30 centimetres and an acute turn. That's a lesser housefly. Usually with lesser housefly, like I mentioned before as well, they're not as impressed by UV light. They will still be attracted to it, but on a lesser degree, and that's to do with their compound eyes and the way that they see things is slightly different. Okay, we've got just a hi, Natalie from Graham. I'm guessing your question will come down a bit later. Yeah, when would you say it is okay? This is from Graham Turner. So when would you say it is okay to use EFKs in loft spaces for controlling cluster flies? Do you have any rules when okay, not okay, in terms of exposure and risk and dust in lofts? And Graham, so Yeah, there's lots of, so in terms of health and safety, let's forget other things for the moment. In terms of health and safety and EFK machines being in there, of course, you've got, fire risks there, depending on what units you're using. And not just from the grid. So if you have Clusterflies in a loft and you put a unit up, normally would have a drop bag under it rather than a tray. Would have a drop bag, because a tray will probably fill up in minutes, maybe hours, but it will fill up very quickly, and then you'll have those flies overspilling onto the floor, which is not a great thing, hard to clear up. But also they could get to the point where they start interfering with the grid, and then that could cause sparks and possibly fires as well. So we need to have that drop bag at the bottom of it so that it can catch lots and lots of flies, and they need to be checked regularly. Again, yes, because of the risk to things like fire and such things. Now, you will only have an EFK in a roof on for a small period of the year. Again, site specific, depends on each site when they become an issue. But if, let's say, it's all of October, this one particular site has problems with Clusterflies, then you will put it in for October. You'll turn it on and then turn it off when the flies have died down again. You don't just leave it on all year round. A, environmentally more friendly, and B, there's no need. You're just in issues. But the other thing you need to think about EFKs in the attic is that is things like bats. So you won't be able to put an EFK in an attic if there are bats. So you need to do a bat inspection. If there's any bat droppings, again, the crumbly, and they taste pretty nice, then you need to speak to the Bat Conservation Trust or Natural England, and they can give you advice on what you can do. They will tell you what you're allowed to do, basically. But if there's any chance that there are bats in an attic, you do nothing. You stop. You do absolutely nothing. Whether it's rodent control, whether it's fly control, you stop and you ask the question, what am I allowed to do? And they'll tell you. We've got a great article next year, hopefully, coming out with a member of ours that had some great work going on with exactly that sort of situation. It was hornets in a chimney, but, there were bats, and, Natural England were involved a lot. I won't go into that now. So, yes, there's all sorts of things you need to consider. Obviously, the health and safety side of things, but also, non-target animals. But other than that, EFKs, they work. Yeah, they're good. Because this is it as well. If your EFK is more long-term, because if you say, right, I'm going to do a fogging treatment, you're going to an attic and say, right, I'm going to do it now. And you need to remember that treatment will only kill the flies that are there at that time. They're generally not residual. Most ULVs or certainly smoke generators, things like that. You can get different formulations. I don't mean that across the board, but generally they're not residual. So it'll only kill those flies that are there at that time. So what about tomorrow and the next day and the next day? Clusterflies aren't just, there's one day of the year they come in and that's it. They'll continue, they'll filter in. There'll be lots of them coming in over a period of a month, maybe even 2 months. So the longer you can leave that treatment, if you're using an insecticide, the better, because the more you're going to get. Whereas an electrical fly killer, as soon as we start noticing them, they can turn it on and leave it on until the problem has sorted itself out, with the regular removal, of course, of the flies that have been caught or killed. And then turn it off again. So but site specific again. I am going to do one more question, because we're nearly 10 minutes over, and I think that's about how late I was. So we'll do one more question. We have got 21 of them, so I'm really sorry I can't get through 21, but I will get an email out to you over the next few days with answers to these questions. Would swallowing a spider cancel the fly? Well, that sounds like a song to me. That's a song we could come up with, isn't it? Yeah, swallow the spider. I like funny things like that. What's the full meaning of EFK, please? Oh, sorry, again, I mentioned in the beginning, this for new entrants to the industry, and I didn't explain. So electrical fly killer is what EFK stands for. So you normally got an electrical grid, and then either a catch tray at the bottom, and then usually a lot of the time in food businesses, as I mentioned, we've only got an hour. I can't go into as much detail, unfortunately, but in food premises, a lot of the time, the electrical fly killers will actually have a glue pad that catches the dead flies rather than an electrical grid that explodes them. Because, of course, if you've got a food prep area and you've got an electrical fly killer nearby and you've got a grid that obliterates that fly, it's not good for contamination. So we usually use those glue catches there. Okay. listen, guys, I'm going to leave it there. Really sorry I haven't got to all the questions. You're all very kind to me, and you all stayed with us. We've still got 160 of you. So thank you very much. I will get those questions out to you. And as always, give me an email or a phone call if you've got any questions, about flies or anything else. Okay, it was a pleasure. Thank you very much.